Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Zac Pearson, and I'm going to be doing the presentation on the rhetorical mode definition. The general way people explain definition is you state and explain the topic. You state the different definitions, maybe different abstract things, and you explain it, conveying the meaning. What is definition? Definition is stating the term you're defining and then expanding on it. Basically, you try to use a word, you try to introduce your definition that you want to argue with. If you're in an argument or if you're an informative, you use your definition of the specific word that you can do your basis off of so that everybody is on the same page. Now, in most cases, the author will expand on the topic after the initial introduction just to make their paper more convincing, more professional, and just flat out better. Because if you just define a word, that's not really doing much in names of the actual presentation. Now, most of the time, a lot of problems come up when different authorities are arguing a term, but one side has a specific definition for the term and another side has a different definition for the term. Now, the only reason this is bad is because the two sides might agree on what they're actually arguing, but if they don't get the definition down, they'll never be able to come together, not necessarily come together, but they'll never be able to get what they're trying to get across properly and in the right manner. Now, why use definition over the other different rhetorical modes like description or compare and contrast? Definition can give your audience a deeper perspective of your topic and your context. So this is kind of leading back to what I was just saying, is that your audience can have a different interpretation of your word that you're trying to define, but the fact that you actually explain the definition of your word, you have the ability to argue it in that sense, and it gives somebody a different perspective if they were looking at a term in a different context. Now, a definition gives the audience the ability to interpret your word, phrase, or general speaking point. Now, this is true because people can have different opinions and different interpretations of a word. I'm not going to go into very many examples just to avoid controversy, but people can have different interpretations of a word, or maybe it's a phrase that is being widespread and some people are using it, but it might not be to the extent of what the actual phrase means. And this is a photo or diagram illustrating the different rhetorical modes. Definition is in the bottom left. It's a little tree map. I just put this in because it gives a little bit of context to how many different rhetorical devices there are that you can use. But definition, you clarify meaning, you set a foundation for your argument, and you give background on the actual definition. Now, the features of definition is that you can connect unorthodox or unusual phrase or topic to something more popular. So you can maybe use a word and define it, and it ends up being a synonym to a more common word where you can connect it and you can expand the audience's vocabulary. Definition can expose the audience to a new definition of the word or a context to a phrase they already use. So, like what I was just saying, that you can have a synonym of a mainstream common phrase or word, but a lot of people don't know of it because it may be more unorthodox or just it's not as common because it's might be a longer word, might just be a harder phrase to say, might be harder to fit in grammar wise. And you can really expand people's vocabulary and show people that it's not just what one definition is, especially in the English language. Now, some tips for using definition. Start with the specific definition of the word or phrase you're trying to use, then broaden and describe it later in the paper. So basically, you're trying to use the ground rules of your definition for that phrase, and then you're going to try to broaden it up and describe it later in the paper to try to convey this different meaning of the phrase to your audience. Now, using synonyms can give a broader perspective that maybe some may recognize more in the audience. So that's what I was saying. These synonyms can really expand people's vocabulary and can maybe get them to understand it and comprehend it more if they are more familiar with something that's very similar to it. And using the proper verbiage for the audience present so that the highest percent of your audience can comprehend what you're saying. This is very helpful because some phrases might be more complex and you don't have the ability to maybe explain it fully because you're speaking to a lower education audience, like say you're speaking to fifth graders or versus seniors in high school. You're going to have a lot different vocabulary that you use because the seniors in high school should be more exposed to different words and verbiage, and they have more of an expansive vocabulary. More tips for using definition. Now this is an example. I'm going to use the topic of breakfast. Now breakfast, for most people, is the first meal of the day, and some people will split it up. Breakfast, break, fast, which fasting being not eating. You normally don't eat from dinner the past night to breakfast in the morning. So this is normally people's first meal of the day, and they're breaking their fast over the night. Now, you can use maybe a different definition if people say breakfast for dinner. Breakfast would then be more morning foods like eggs, bacon, Canadian bacon, pancakes, that kind of deal. Instead of necessarily breaking the fast from that night, it could be the foods that are common in breakfast. Now, another tip for later in the paper is you could describe where breakfast comes from or how it affects the body in a certain way. These are my references, and thank you for listening.